Hey dear beautiful souls, it's another lovely day on Epic Tales by Oma. Thank you for always watching, liking and supporting. Please share this video with your family and friends. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Grab a seat, relax, and let's get into today's amazing African tale. The small village of Willowbrook was a place where everyone knew everyone's story. Houses were built close to one another, and gossip traveled faster than the Harmattan wind. At the far end of the village lived a woman named Miriam. She was not like other women who had husbands to support them. Miriam was a widow, left alone in a world that was often unkind to women like her. Her husband had died many years ago when her only son, Ethan, was barely 2 years old. His death came suddenly, leaving her with nothing but memories, unpaid debts, and the heavy weight of raising a child alone. The villagers whispered that perhaps Miriam carried a curse. Some said she was the reason her husband died young. Others claimed she had brought misfortune upon herself. Every day when she stepped out of her mud house, she felt their eyes on her. Their whispers stung like sharp thorns. "There goes the cursed woman," one woman muttered one morning as Miriam walked past carrying a bundle of firewood on her head. "Yes," another replied, lowering her voice, but not enough for Miriam to miss it. "Her husband couldn't survive living with her. That's why death took him." Miriam kept her eyes on the path, pretending not to hear. Her heart ached, but she refused to let their words break her. She had a son to raise, and that was all that mattered. Her boy, Ethan, was her treasure. His eyes sparkled with innocence and hope, even though he too had begun to notice the way people looked at them. Many children in the village mocked him. "Son of a cursed woman," they would shout as he passed by on his way to school, barefoot, with a small worn-out bag on his back. At first, Ethan cried whenever he was called names. He would run to his mother and bury his face in her wrapper, but Miriam always bent low, cupping his face gently and whispered, "Don't mind them, my son. Their words are like smoke. They disappear. But your future is like fire. It will shine if you keep it burning." Those words stayed with Ethan. Life for Miriam was not easy. Every morning, long before the cock crowed, she would wake up, fetch water, and trek to the nearby forest to gather firewood. With tired arms, she carried the heavy load to the market to sell. Sometimes, when firewood didn't bring much money, she fetched water in clay pots and sold it to villagers who could afford to pay. On days when work was scarce, she offered her strength to help on people's farms. She bent under the sun, weeding, planting, or harvesting, earning just a few coins. She saved every bit she could so that Ethan would never miss school. At night, when the day's work left her bones aching, Miriam still found the strength to light a kerosene lamp for Ethan. She would sit beside him, watching him bend over his books, his lips moving as he read aloud. "Mama," he said one night, his small fingers tracing the words in an old exercise book. "One day, I will become somebody great. I will make you proud." Tears filled Miriam's eyes. She reached out, brushing his hair gently. "You already make me proud, Ethan. But if you promise me one thing, promise me you will never give up, no matter how hard life becomes." "I promise, Mama," Ethan said with determination in his young voice. Though poor, Miriam did her best to give Ethan love. Their meals were often simple. Sometimes just boiled cassava with a pinch of salt or maize roasted over fire. Yet whenever they ate, Miriam smiled and said, "This food may be little, but with love it fills the belly." Ethan never forgot those moments. He loved his mother deeply, and though he was still young, he carried her words in his heart like a secret treasure. But not everyone in Willowbrook saw Miriam's strength. Many women in the village looked down on her. At gatherings, they excluded her. At the well, they mocked her clothes, which were always faded from years of washing. One day, as Miriam came to fetch water, a woman named Priscilla scoffed loudly. "Look at her, always struggling. If only she had been a better wife, her husband would still be alive." Another woman laughed. "She thinks her son will change anything. That boy will end up just like her, poor and hopeless." Miriam's hands trembled as she tied her water pot, but she said nothing. She had learned to keep quiet, for arguing only gave them more reason to laugh. She turned, balancing the pot on her head, and walked away with dignity. That night, sitting under the moonlight, Ethan noticed his mother was quieter than usual. "Mama," he said softly, "did they say bad things again?" Miriam tried to smile. "Don't worry about that, Ethan. People will always talk, but what matters is what we believe." "And what do we believe?" Ethan asked. Miriam's voice was firm as she replied, "We believe that tomorrow can be better than today. We believe that the sweat of hard work never goes in vain. And we believe that love is stronger than mockery." Ethan nodded, his small hands holding hers tightly. "Then I will never stop believing with you, Mama." That night, Miriam looked at the stars and whispered a prayer. She prayed for strength, for courage, and for her son's future. Deep in her heart, she knew that though the road ahead was long and hard, she and Ethan would walk it together. The villagers saw her as cursed. They saw Ethan as a hopeless boy. But Miriam saw something else. She saw in her son's eyes a fire that would one day light up not only their lives, but the whole of Willowbrook. And so, even though the burden was heavy, Miriam carried it with faith, for her love for Ethan was stronger than any gossip, any hunger, and any pain. The days in Willowbrook were long, and for Miriam, each sunrise carried with it a new battle. She had no one to lean on, no one to share her burdens with. Yet she rose every morning determined that her son, Ethan, would not be swallowed by poverty. Long before the roosters crowed, Miriam would tie her faded wrapper firmly around her waist, sling a basket over her shoulder, and begin her trek to the forest. The path was narrow, filled with stones and thorny bushes that scratched her legs. But she pressed on. She gathered firewood with her bare hands, her palms often blistered from carrying heavy bundles. One morning, as she struggled to lift a particularly large pile, Ethan, now a little older, ran to her side. "Mama, let me help you," he said, his small hands reaching for the load. Miriam shook her head gently. "No, Ethan, this is not your burden. Your burden is your books. Your duty is to study, so that one day you will not carry wood like this." "But Mama," Ethan protested, "I don't want you to suffer." Miriam smiled, though her eyes carried hidden pain. "Every sweat that drops from me is not suffering. It is an investment. One day you will see." With those words, she lifted the bundle onto her head and began the long walk to the market. At the marketplace, Miriam sat under the hot sun waiting for buyers. Other women with wealthier husbands had large stalls selling rice, beans, and spices. Their colorful wrappers shone brightly, and their laughter filled the air. Miriam, however, sat quietly with her pile of firewood and small containers of water she had fetched earlier. When customers walked past, she called out politely. Some ignored her, others mocked her. "Why buy from her?" one woman sneered. "Her firewood carries bad luck." The words pierced her heart, but she kept her head high. Slowly, little by little, she sold enough to buy a small bowl of maize for dinner and a piece of chalk for Ethan's school. That evening, as she stirred the maize porridge in their clay pot, Ethan sat nearby, his books open. The flicker of their kerosene lamp lit his face. Miriam watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with love. "You know, Ethan," she said softly, "when I was your age, I never had the chance to go to school. That is why I work so hard for you. You will go further than I ever could." Ethan looked up from his book. "And when I grow up, Mama, I will buy you a new wrapper. Not the old faded ones. You will wear fine clothes like the rich women in the market." Miriam laughed gently, though tears threatened to fall. "My son, what I want is not clothes. What I want is to see you shine." But life was not always kind. There were days when she came home empty-handed. On such nights, they went to bed hungry, their stomachs rumbling in the silence. Ethan sometimes cried quietly, but Miriam would hold him close. "Hush, my boy," she whispered. Hunger is just a visitor. Tomorrow we will chase it away. Even in her darkest moments, Miriam never stopped giving. If a neighbor's child fell sick and needed herbs, she was the first to offer help. If a stranger knocked at her door in need of water, she never refused. Though she had little, she shared freely. Yet many of those she helped were the same ones who mocked her. One afternoon, as Ethan walked home from school, he heard a group of boys laughing. "Ethan!" one shouted. "Your mother is in the market begging again, isn't she? Does she even have food for you tonight?" Another added, holding his stomach in fake laughter. Ethan clenched his fists, his face burning with shame. But instead of fighting, he replied firmly, "My mother is stronger than all your mothers. She works harder than 10 men. One day, you will see." The boys laughed louder, but deep inside, Ethan's words carried a fire that none of them could quench. When he reached home, he told his mother about the teasing. Miriam took his hand gently and said, "Do not answer them with anger. Answer them with your success. That will be your loudest reply." From that day, Ethan began to work even harder in school. He read under the moonlight when the kerosene lamp went out. He asked his teachers questions until they grew tired of answering. His exercise books were filled with notes, though some pages were patched with old scraps of paper because new books were too expensive. Meanwhile, Miriam's body grew weaker from years of labor. Her back often ached, and her hands were rough from endless work. Yet she never complained. One night, as Ethan rubbed her sore arms, he asked quietly, "Mama, why do you do all this for me?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with love. "Because you are my tomorrow, Ethan. If I do not fight for you today, who will fight for you tomorrow?" Her words sank deep into Ethan's heart. He knew then that his mother's sacrifices were not just for survival. They were seeds, planted with pain, watered with tears, and waiting for a day when they would bear fruit. And though the villagers still mocked them, and though hunger still visited their small home, Miriam and Ethan held on to each other. They had little, but they had love, and that love was stronger than poverty, stronger than gossip, and stronger than despair. Ethan was not like many other children in Willowbrook. While most boys his age spent afternoons chasing goats in the fields or playing in the dusty paths, Ethan's joy came from reading. His mother's words, "Your duty is your books," echoed in his heart every day. At the village school, Ethan was always the first to arrive. Sometimes he came with an empty stomach, but his eyes were always eager, searching for knowledge. He carried his small worn-out bag with just 2 exercise books and 1 borrowed pencil that had been sharpened so much it was almost too short to hold. His classmates often mocked him. "Look at his shoes," one boy said, pointing at Ethan's feet, covered only with old sandals tied together with rope. "His mother cannot even buy him a pen," another added with a cruel laugh. Ethan heard their voices, but he refused to let them enter his heart. Whenever they laughed, he whispered to himself, "My mother's sweat will never be wasted. I will show them one day." Despite his struggles, Ethan's teachers noticed his brilliance. He listened with sharp attention, answered questions confidently, and often stayed back after class to ask more. "Ethan," his teacher, Mr. Collins, said one afternoon, "you have a mind that shines brighter than the sun. Never let anyone make you believe you are less because you are poor." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, sir. I will not forget." At home, nights were filled with quiet study. When the kerosene lamp ran out, Ethan sat outside under the moonlight, tracing words with his finger in the sand. Sometimes he repeated lessons aloud, his voice carrying into the night air. Neighbors would shake their heads. "That boy is wasting his time," they said. "Books cannot put food on the table." But Miriam believed otherwise. She often sat beside him, watching him read, her face lit with quiet hope. "Keep going, Ethan," she would whisper. One day, your light will shine so bright that even the blind will see it. School days were not always easy. There were times when Ethan had no lunch, times when he fainted from hunger in class. Yet whenever he regained his strength, he returned with the same determination. He reminded himself of his promise to his mother that he would never give up. One day, the school announced a regional competition for the brightest students. Only one child from Willowbrook School could be chosen. Many laughed when Ethan's name was mentioned. "How can the poor widow's son represent us?" one parent complained. But the teachers, who knew Ethan's brilliance, insisted he was the right choice. Miriam's heart pounded with both fear and pride when she heard the news. That evening, as Ethan sat with her under the mango tree, she held his hands tightly. "My son, this is your chance. Do not fear what people say. Walk into that hall with your head high. Remember, you carry not only your dreams, but mine as well." Ethan nodded firmly. "I will not fail you, Mama." On the day of the competition, Ethan wore his cleanest shirt, which Miriam had washed carefully the night before. Though the fabric was old and thin, she ironed it neatly with a hot stone. She kissed his forehead before he left. "Go, my son. Show them who you are." In the hall, surrounded by students from wealthier schools, Ethan felt small for a moment. Their shoes shone, their uniforms were new, and their books were plenty. But then he remembered his mother's tired hands and her endless sacrifices. A fire rose inside him. When the questions began, Ethan answered with courage. His voice was clear, his mind sharp. Each time he spoke, the judges looked at him with growing admiration. At the end of the day, when the results were announced, Ethan had won first place. The hall erupted with applause. His classmates, who once mocked him, stared in disbelief. Teachers from other schools praised him, asking, "Whose son is this?" Ethan lifted his chin and replied proudly, "I am Miriam's son, the widow's son." When the news reached Willowbrook, the same villagers who had once mocked Miriam now clapped their hands in praise. "That boy is special," they said. "Maybe we were wrong about him." That night, when Ethan returned home with his certificate, Miriam hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You see, Ethan, the world is beginning to see what I already knew. You are destined for greatness." Ethan smiled, pressing the paper into her hands. "This is not my victory alone, Mama. It is yours too. For every bundle of firewood you carried, for every coin you saved, for every hunger you endured, this is the fruit." Miriam's heart swelled with gratitude. In that moment, she knew her sacrifices were beginning to bear fruit. Yet she also knew the road ahead was still long. Ethan's dream had only just begun, and she would stand by him every step of the way. The morning sun rose gently over Willowbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. For most villagers, it was just another ordinary day. But for Miriam and her son Ethan, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. Weeks earlier, a letter had arrived at the village school. It was sealed with the crest of the state government. Mr. Collins, Ethan's teacher, had gathered the class together and called Ethan's name with a trembling voice. "Ethan," he said, holding up the paper, "you have been awarded a full scholarship to the prestigious Crown City University." For a moment, the classroom was silent. Then whispers spread like wildfire. "The widow's son," one boy muttered. "Impossible," another exclaimed. But it was true. Ethan had done so well in his exams that he had been chosen above hundreds of students across the region. The scholarship covered his tuition, books, and a place to stay in the city. When Ethan carried the letter home, Miriam read it over and over, tears rolling down her cheeks. She pressed the paper against her chest and whispered, "Thank you, God. You have remembered me and my son." From that day, their little home was filled with both excitement and sadness. Miriam knew her boy was about to step into a new world far away from her. Ethan, though overjoyed, also worried about leaving his mother behind. The night before his departure, Miriam prepared a small meal of yam and palm oil. She served it with care, as though it were a royal feast. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the moment. Afterward, Ethan packed his small bag. It was old, patched in many places, but it was all he had. Miriam slipped a folded cloth bag into his hands. Inside were roasted ground nuts and dried fish, the only food she could afford for his journey. "My son," she said softly, "this is all I have to give you. It may not be much, but it carries my love." Ethan hugged her tightly. "Mama, you have already given me more than enough. You gave me your sweat, your tears, your strength. This journey is your gift to me." The next morning, the villagers gathered to see him off. Some came out of curiosity, others out of pride. Many who had once mocked Miriam now spoke in softer tones. "Look at him," one man whispered. "The widow's son is going to the city." "Truly, tomorrow belongs to no one," another added. Miriam walked beside Ethan to the bus station, her hands trembling as she held his. Her heart was heavy, yet filled with joy. When the bus finally arrived, Ethan turned to face her. "Mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I will make you proud, I promise." Miriam cupped his face in her hands, her eyes glistening. "My son, you have already made me proud. But remember this, no matter how far you go, never forget where you come from. Remember Willowbrook. Remember me." "I will never forget," Ethan whispered. As the bus engine roared to life, Miriam pressed a final kiss on his forehead. She stood there, watching as the bus drove away, carrying her boy into a future she could only imagine. When the dust settled, Miriam remained at the station, her eyes fixed on the road. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of hope. She whispered a prayer under her breath. "God, keep my son safe. Guide his steps. Let his dreams not be cut short. And when the world sees him, let them also see the widow's tears that watered his journey." Back in Willowbrook, Miriam returned to her home, now emptier without Ethan's laughter. The mango tree in front of the house seemed quieter too, yet she held on to her faith, believing that one day her son would return, not as the poor boy they once mocked, but as a man whose light could not be hidden. Meanwhile, in the city, Ethan's journey had just begun. The streets were wider, the buildings taller, and the people busier than anything he had ever known. His stomach rumbled with hunger, his pockets were empty, but his spirit burned with determination. For every step he took, he carried his mother's words with him. "Never forget where you come from." The city was nothing like Willowbrook. It was noisy, crowded, and filled with people who seemed always in a hurry. The buses roared past, horns blaring, and the streets bustled with traders shouting the prices of their goods. For Ethan, it was overwhelming at first. He had arrived with only his small patched bag and the cloth bundle his mother gave him. The roasted groundnuts and dried fish became his first meals in the city. Each bite reminded him of home and of his mother's trembling hands when she pressed the bag into his palm. The scholarship paid for his school fees and a small room at the university hostel, but it did not cover food or clothing. Many nights, Ethan lay on his thin mattress, his stomach growling with hunger. He often drank water to silence the ache before turning to his books. "I cannot fail," he whispered to himself in the darkness. "Mama's sweat must not be wasted." To survive, Ethan looked for small jobs. In the mornings before lectures, he washed cars for busy businessmen. On weekends, he carried heavy loads for traders at the bus station. Sometimes, when the sun was scorching, he walked the streets selling sachets of water. People often stared at him in disbelief. "Is that not the scholarship boy?" some asked. "Yes," others replied with pity. The poor widow's son, even in the city, poverty follows him. But Ethan refused to bow to shame. He smiled at every insult, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and reminded himself, this is only for a while. One day, things will change. Despite his struggles, Ethan never missed a single class. He sat in the front row, eager and attentive, scribbling notes with the same short pencil he had used back in Willowbrook. Professors soon noticed his brilliance. His answers were sharp, his questions thoughtful, and his essays always stood out. One day, after a lecture, Professor Daniels called him aside. "Ethan," he said kindly, "you have a rare gift, but you look tired all the time. Are you feeding well?" Ethan lowered his head, ashamed. "I try, sir. Sometimes it is not easy." The professor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not give up, son. Great men are made in the fire of hardship. Endure and you will shine." Those words gave Ethan new strength. He poured himself even deeper into his studies, spending long nights in the library. There were times when he fell asleep over his books, his stomach empty, but his mind still chasing knowledge. Some classmates looked down on him. They wore fine clothes, carried expensive bags, and mocked his patched shirt. "Why does he bother?" one student laughed. "With his background, he will never amount to much." But there were also a few who admired him. A girl named Grace once said, "That boy is different. You can see it in his eyes. He will not remain where he is forever." Years passed in this way. Ethan worked, studied, and endured hunger. His hands grew calloused from washing cars, but his mind grew sharper with every book he read. Whenever he felt like giving up, he remembered Miriam's voice. "Your tomorrow can be better than today." Finally, the day of graduation arrived. Students in bright gowns filled the auditorium, their families seated proudly in the audience. Miriam could not afford to travel from Willowbrook, but Ethan carried her presence in his heart. When the chancellor announced the best graduating student, the hall grew silent. The award for overall best student goes to Ethan, son of Miriam from Willowbrook. The room erupted in applause. Ethan stood slowly, his heart pounding. As he walked to the stage, he thought of his mother fetching firewood at dawn, selling water under the sun, and going to bed hungry just so he could study. He held the certificate high, and with tears in his eyes, he whispered, "Mama, we did it." News of his achievements spread quickly. Even before Ethan could return home, Willowbrook was buzzing with excitement. The same villagers who once mocked Miriam now praised her. "Her son is the pride of the land," they said. "Truly, the widow is blessed." But for Miriam, sitting quietly under the mango tree, it was not the villagers' praise that mattered. It was the knowledge that her endless sacrifices had finally borne fruit. The sun was setting over Willowbrook when the news reached the village. Children ran from house to house shouting, "Ethan has graduated! Ethan is the best in the whole school." Miriam was sitting outside her hut, weaving a small mat. When she heard the voices, she paused, her hands trembling, and looked up. Could it be true? Her son, the same boy who once carried firewood on his back and studied under a dim lantern, had become the pride of an entire university. By the next morning, villagers crowded her compound. Men who once mocked her poverty now bowed their heads with respect. Women who had whispered insults behind her back came forward with forced smiles. "Mama Ethan," they said sweetly, "you are blessed indeed. Who would have thought this boy of yours would bring glory to our land?" Miriam smiled faintly, but in her heart she remembered their cruelty. She said nothing, only thanked God quietly, her eyes glistening with tears. Far away in the city, Ethan's life was already beginning to change. After graduation, he was offered a position as an assistant lecturer at the university. He also received a scholarship for further studies abroad. Opportunities that once seemed impossible were now opening before him like a wide road. But Ethan did not forget where he came from. On the day he received his first salary, he sat alone in his small room and whispered, "This belongs to Mama." He carefully wrapped the money in an envelope and sent it to Willowbrook. When Miriam received the letter, she opened it with trembling hands. Inside was more money than she had ever seen at once. She pressed it to her chest and cried. "My son remembers me," she sobbed. After all the hunger, after all the shame, he remembers me. From that day, Miriam's life began to change. She no longer fetched firewood for survival. Ethan sent her enough to buy food, clothes, and even repair the leaking roof of her hut. Neighbors who once sneered at her now greeted her with deep respect. At the village square, elders said proudly, "The poor widow's son has lifted the name of Willowbrook." Truly, greatness can come from the lowliest of homes. But Ethan's greatest joy was not the respect of the villagers. It was the smile on his mother's face whenever he visited home. He remembered too well the lines of worry on her forehead, the nights she went hungry so he could eat, and the prayers she whispered over him as he studied. Now he was determined to give her a new life. One Sunday, during a Thanksgiving service in the village church, Ethan stood before the congregation with Miriam by his side. The church was packed. Everyone wanted to see the widow's son who had risen so high. With tears in his eyes, Ethan said, "Everything I am today, I owe to my mother. She gave when she had nothing. She believed when no one else did. Mama, this victory belongs to you." The congregation clapped and some even wept. Miriam could not hold back her tears. She lifted her hands to heaven and said, "Lord, you have remembered me. You have turned my shame into honor." That day, the poor widow was no longer just Miriam. She became Mama Ethan, a name spoken with respect, and her son was no longer the barefoot boy mocked in the village. He was now a man of honor, proof that poverty could not silence a determined spirit. But this was only the beginning. Greater things still awaited Ethan, trials that would test his strength again, and victories that would lift his family even higher. The dry season sun shone brightly over Willowbrook. The dusty road that led into the village was crowded that afternoon, not because of market day, but because word had spread quickly. Ethan was coming home. Children ran barefoot, shouting in excitement. Women tied wrappers around their waists and stood at their doorways, waiting to catch the first glimpse of the boy who had once left the village with nothing but a cloth bag of ground nuts and dried fish. Now he was returning as a man who had conquered life's mountains. Miriam sat under the mango tree in front of her house, her heart racing with joy. She had swept the compound 3 times that morning, unable to contain her excitement. She wore a clean wrapper and a white blouse Ethan had sent her from the city. Her neighbors whispered among themselves, "Mama Ethan is blessed indeed. Look how her story has changed." At the edge of the village, a car engine roared. Then it appeared, a shiny black car that sparkled like polished glass. The villagers gasped. Never before had such a vehicle entered Willowbrook. Some covered their mouths, others pointed with wide eyes. The car slowed as it entered the village square. Children clapped and danced behind it, raising dust. When it stopped before Miriam's compound, Ethan stepped out. He was no longer the thin boy with patched school shorts. He stood tall, dressed in a crisp shirt and trousers, his shoes shining. His smile was wide, but his eyes filled with tears the moment he saw his mother. "Mama!" Ethan called, rushing forward. "My son!" Miriam cried, her voice breaking as she threw her arms around him. The villagers watched as mother and son embraced tightly, both shaking with emotion. Some wiped their own tears. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan reached into the car and brought out boxes, bags, and gifts. "Mama," he said softly, "I told you your sweat would never be wasted. This is only the beginning." Miriam held his hand, too overwhelmed to speak. She simply nodded, tears streaming down her face. That evening, the entire village gathered in her compound. Ethan stood before them and addressed the crowd. "When I was a boy," he began, "many of you laughed at me. You said I was just a poor widow's son. But my mother taught me something, that poverty does not define who you will become. Hard work, prayer, and faith can change any story. I stand here today to prove that her words are true." The villagers clapped loudly, some bowing their heads in shame, others nodding in agreement. Ethan then surprised them all. He announced, "I will build my mother a new house here in Willowbrook. and I will also help children in this village to go to school so that no child suffers the way I once did." The crowd erupted in cheers. Some shouted, "Long live Ethan! Long live Mama Ethan!" Weeks later, a beautiful house stood where Miriam's old mud hut once leaned. Painted white with a red roof and glass windows, it became the pride of the village. People came from neighboring towns just to see the house of the poor widow who had once been mocked. But for Miriam, the true joy was not the house or the wealth. It was sitting under her mango tree each evening, watching Ethan smile, hearing his laughter, and knowing that her endless sacrifices had borne fruit. One night, as the moonlight bathed the compound, Ethan sat beside her. "Mama," he said gently, "this is only the beginning. I want to build schools, start businesses, and help others rise too, because I know what it feels like to be poor." Miriam touched his cheek, her eyes glowing. "My son," she whispered, "you have made me the happiest mother alive. May your light never grow dim." And so, Ethan's return home became more than a celebration of one man's success. It was a reminder to every villager that tomorrow can turn shame into honor and that no struggle should ever be mocked. The new house in Willowbrook stood tall and proud, shining under the morning sun. It was the first of its kind in the village, a 2-bedroom bungalow with glass windows and a painted veranda. For Miriam, who had once slept in a leaking mud hut, the house was more than just shelter. It was the evidence that pain could be turned into joy. Every evening, Miriam sat under the old mango tree in front of the compound. That tree had witnessed her years of sorrow. She had cried under its shade when she could not provide food for Ethan. She had prayed under it when villagers mocked her. She had whispered encouragement to her son beneath its branches. And now she sat there watching the fruits of her sacrifice ripen before her eyes. The villagers often gathered near the compound to look at the house, some in awe, others in silent shame. Children ran around laughing as Ethan played with them whenever he visited. He had become more than just Miriam's son. He was now a symbol of hope for every struggling child in Willowbrook. A morning of reflection. 1. Cool morning, Miriam sat under the mango tree with a calabash of water beside her. The air was fresh and birds chirped from the branches above. She leaned back and closed her eyes. In her mind, she traveled back in time to the days when she would walk barefoot to the market, carrying firewood on her head. She remembered the heavy baskets, the cuts on her feet, and the hunger that gnawed at her belly as she labored for pennies. She remembered the gossiping voices that said, "She is cursed. Her husband died, and now she will rot in poverty." Her heart ached as she thought of those painful years. But then her mind shifted to Ethan, the little boy who held her hand, who studied with determination even when the lamp burned low, who promised that her sweat would never be wasted. Her lips trembled into a smile. "Truly, God answers the cries of widows," she whispered. That afternoon, Ethan gathered the villagers under the mango tree. News had already spread that he wanted to address the community. Men, women, and children filled the compound, eager to hear what he had to say. Standing tall beside his mother, Ethan began, "When I was young, I suffered hunger, shame, and ridicule. Many of you remember those days, but my mother never gave up. She sacrificed everything so I could go to school. Today, by God's grace, I have seen success, and I cannot enjoy it alone." He paused, looking at the crowd. The villagers leaned forward, curious. "I will build a school here in Willowbrook," Ethan declared. "No child should have to sell firewood or skip meals just to buy an exercise book. Every child deserves a chance to dream, and I will make sure they have that chance." The villagers gasped, then broke into loud cheers. Some clapped, others shouted his name. Tears filled Miriam's eyes as she listened. Ethan continued, "I will also set up a small clinic. Too many times I saw children fall sick with no money for medicine. That must end. Willowbrook will no longer be a village forgotten. We will rise together." The crowd erupted with joy. People danced, women ululated, and children sang. Ethan's words were like a fresh wind sweeping away years of despair from the village. That evening, after the crowd dispersed, Miriam sat with her son under the mango tree. The moon cast a silver glow over the compound. "Mama," Ethan said softly, "I remember the day I left for the city. You pressed a bag of groundnuts and dried fish into my hand and told me not to forget where I came from. Mama, I never forgot. I carried your words with me through hunger, through sleepless nights, through every struggle. Everything I do now is because of you." Miriam reached for his hand and held it tightly. Her voice shook as she replied, "My son, you were my only hope. There were nights I thought I would not live to see you grow, but God kept me alive for this moment. You have wiped away my tears. I am proud of you, Ethan. So proud." Ethan leaned his head on her shoulder, and for a while they sat in silence, listening to the rustle of the mango leaves above them. In the weeks that followed, construction began. A group of young men dug the foundation for the new school, while women cooked meals for the workers. The entire village buzzed with excitement. One afternoon, a group of women sat under the tree near Miriam's compound, talking among themselves. "Do you remember when we used to laugh at her?" one asked, lowering her voice. "Yes," another admitted, shame in her tone. "We said she was cursed. We mocked her son too. But look at them now. She is the mother of the most respected man in Willowbrook." The third woman sighed deeply. "It is a lesson for all of us. We must never mock the struggles of others. Who knows what tomorrow holds?" The women nodded, humbled by the truth, and from that day, the villagers began to treat the poor with more kindness, remembering how wrong they had once been about Miriam. Months later, the school was completed. It was painted cream and green, with wide windows and a large blackboard inside each classroom. Children who once carried hoes to the farm now carried books in their hands. Parents who had thought education was only for the rich smiled as they watched their children march proudly to class. At the opening ceremony, Ethan invited everyone. The village square was decorated with palm fronds and bright cloths. Drummers played, dancers performed, and elders prayed blessings over Ethan and Miriam. When Miriam was called to speak, she stood slowly, her wrapper tied neatly and her head covered with a scarf. Her voice was steady, though her eyes glistened. "My people," she began, "you all knew me when I was nothing. You saw my shame, my tears, and my poverty. But today you see what God has done. He has turned my mourning into dancing. If you are a mother or father struggling today, do not give up. If you are mocked, do not lose hope. Tomorrow belongs to God, and He can change your story." The crowd clapped and cheered, touched by her words. Some wept openly, feeling the weight of her testimony. That night, long after the celebrations ended, Miriam returned to her favorite spot under the mango tree. The moon was high and the air was calm. Ethan joined her, carrying a lantern. "Mama," he said softly, "why do you love sitting under this tree so much?" Miriam smiled gently. "This tree knows my story," she replied. "It heard my cries when no one else cared. It gave me shade when I had no rest, and it has witnessed my tears turn into joy. To me, this tree is a reminder that no season lasts forever. Even in drought, it still bore fruit, just like our lives." Ethan looked at the tree, its branches swaying lightly in the night breeze. He nodded. "Then let us make it a symbol. From today, this mango tree will remind Willowbrook of hope. Whenever people feel discouraged, they can come here and remember your story, Mama." Miriam's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of peace. "Yes, my son," she whispered. "Let this tree stand as a lesson for generations." Years later, visitors to Willowbrook would often stop under the mango tree. Children would gather to hear the story of Miriam, the widow who was mocked but never gave up, and Ethan, her son who rose from poverty to greatness. And whenever Miriam sat there, surrounded by laughter and love, her heart overflowed with gratitude. Not because of the wealth, not because of the respect, But because her sacrifices had not been in vain, the villagers learned their lesson well. Never mock the struggle of others, for tomorrow is full of surprises. And beneath the shade of the mango tree, Miriam finally found the peace she had long prayed for. The story of Miriam and Ethan teaches us that no one should look down on another person's struggle, because life can change at any moment. Miriam's sacrifices and Ethan's determination show that with love, hard work, and perseverance, even the hardest beginnings can lead to a life of honor. True success is not just about wealth, but about turning pain into strength and making tomorrow brighter than today. Thank you so much for watching. Your love and support mean everything to me. If this story inspired you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones to spread the inspiration. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more interesting African stories. See you in the next video. Bye.